And next we have Simon Levine, a Senior Research Fellow here at ODI and co-author of the report that we'll be discussing today. And if any of you don't have a copy of the report, please find it just by the entrance here. There's a big stack there along with some other products from ODI on similar topics that you might find interesting. But this is Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all, and thanks to Tom. I've never been called an exciting agenda before, so that's nice. Yeah, I'm speaking on behalf of the ODI team that was doing the research. So before I start, I should just introduce Ava and Lindsay, who are at the door. Ava, do you want to stand up? And so the presentation, the report, all of our analysis, it was the team of three. We worked together. So please, if any of you have any difficult, challenging questions, feel free to pose them to Ava and Lindsay. I'll be happy to answer. So you've all come to today about adaptive capacity, which I have to admit is a term that I didn't know until that recently, and then you start to wonder why not, because it does seem to be at the heart of everything. Why does it matter? We start with basically a few obvious facts. First couple of slides. Change is a constant in everyone's lives. Far more so if you're looking at rural people in Africa. And sometimes changes are divided up into two. We talk about shocks and stresses. Sometimes there isn't a very clear distinction between the two. The shocks are the things that happen a bit more suddenly, tend to be a bit more drastic and acute. We've got war, displacement, droughts, and so on, things like that. And the stresses are the long, slow changes at which people have to adapt to. Population pressure, not so slow. In one of the Accra countries, Uganda, population doubling every 25 years. So if you think about it, that means average land size of a family passing land down is halving every 25 years. It's a quarter in my lifetime alone of what people had. Terms of trade, we know that the terms of trade have, I think, are about half as good or even less in the last 20 years in terms of what people are selling. Agricultural commodities compared to what they're buying, land degradation and so on. So we have all of this change going on, and then on top of it we've just discovered a new change, relatively just, which is climate change. And climate change is not just another pressure in and of itself in terms of the changing weather, but it interacts with and it actually magnifies lots and lots of other shocks, so that it can magnify land degradation, the potential for it to interact with things like world food prices, with trade. There are fears that if there are more conflicts over resources, and this could cause more displacement and so on. So we have an intermixing of all these different changes. And the only thing that we can say for certain about any of these changes is that two things. One is that they will happen, and the other is that we don't know exactly what they're going to look like. Change is the uncertainty of change is certain, and this is true even of climate change. And now, when we are getting better and better with our modelling. I say we, I'm not the climate scientist, but the climate scientists are getting better and better at the modelling, but they still, at the local level, in the village, they can't say, well, you know, your rainfall is going to go down year by year in this way. If you actually look at the maps, there's a certain probability that the rain will get more in parts of the country and it will get less. So that's not to dispute the reality or the trends, but at local level, we have to say it's still very, very uncertain. Now, there's kind of an obvious conclusion from all of that, which is that no development of any kind at all is going to be sustainable if it cannot be maintained in the face of change. Yeah? So the idea of a development which puts people into a sort of a given more developed state and leaves them there and calls itself sustainable is a contradiction in terms if you accept that the context for which they have to live is going to be one of change. Yeah? And that seems to me to be pretty uncontroversial. And that means if people's ability to maintain their well-being in the face of change is really what we're calling adaptive capacity. It's pretty, it's a non-technical definition. I think Kate will give us some more technical definitions later. But broadly speaking, that's what we're talking about. So we need to know how well. We need to know, is it okay? Are they going to be able to manage? And in order to be able to do that, we want to know, well, how well currently are they able to cope with change? And then we want to know the idea of kind of setting up a whole new stream of projects, interventions and government services for helping people deal with change in parallel with all the other economic development and rural development programs doesn't seem to be very realistic. So we need to know, well, what we're currently doing, the normal development projects of different kinds, the safety nets and the livelihood programs and the DRR stuff, is that having any impact on people's development, people's adaptive capacity? And that is what this research looked like. So we were looking at the development projects in the countries where Joe mentioned, in Ethiopia, Uganda and Mozambique. And I should stress, we were not in any way trying to evaluate the projects. We weren't trying to say, did they bring the benefits which they intended to give? Were they well managed? We weren't looking at that at all. We were looking at something which they didn't set out to give, which was, what was their effect on adaptive capacity? Now, one or two of you might scratch your heads and say, but if it's so obvious that adaptive capacity is a key ingredient of any sustainable development, how is it possible to have a sustainable development program which didn't actually set out to bring adaptive capacity? And I won't comment on your head scratching. Okay, so first, then we get the problem of what is adaptive capacity, and there are endless formula for it, and different people measure it in different ways. And one of the problems with it's not something very, very tangible. It's not something that to do with change. Depends on who you are and what kind of change and when and how you woke up in the morning and so on. So what we tried to do is to try and get some lenses for thinking about it. So this is we didn't try and come up with a formula for measuring it, but just to get some kind of a framework for thinking about it. And that is what this framework is. We presented it about a year ago here. Some of you may have read about it. I don't want to go into it in too great detail, but just to draw on the point that many of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with various livelihoods frameworks. The Sustainable Livelihoods Framework is probably the most famous of them all. And this doesn't try and compete with them or do anything particularly different. What it tries to do is to pull out to the front things which are in those frameworks which are particularly relevant for adaptive capacity. So you'll see things like assets, which we know. and I should, for those who should just make it clear that assets, we're not just talking about like money and land and so on, but the different assets as they are defined in that model, which is around what are called sometimes human capital. So education and skills is in there, and people's social capital, so how well they're networked and so on, their natural environment and infrastructure, all of that is there in the assets. And then we try to pull out, say, some of the more dynamic and some of the ways in which decisions get made. So looking at institutions, knowledge flows, where people get knowledge from and information and how it gets passed around, innovation as a dynamic force in and of itself, and forward-looking governance. So the extent to which decision making is actually looking forward and being predictive so that people can then adapt to that. So that's that. I don't want to go into that too much. Okay, so that's the introduction. What did we find out? All of the research, which was carried out, I say, by John mentioned these local partners, and they went and they asked and they looked at the projects, talked to the people, and what did we find? Well, people are adapting. Yeah. The idea that people are kind of carrying on doing the same thing, year in, year out, absolutely not. People are adapting. But there's two or three problems. First of all, people aren't adapting to climate change. But that's not to say that they're not adapting to it directly. People see climate change as it affects their lives in terms of, for example, prices. In terms of what yields well. It's mixed in with how the soil has changed and how the seasons are changing and so on. So people aren't isolating it as a factor, but it's in there. One of the problems is people's adaptation, is almost entirely reactive. So we didn't find people looking forward and saying, well, I've heard that this is going to be the trend in the next 5 years, so here is how I am now trying to build in my change. What people are saying is, oh, the past 5 years I have found that this has happened, so now I have to react. The rains used to start in March, now they don't start till April, so now I'm having to grow this instead of grow that. And the other thing is that, possibly predictably, there is a very, very strong focus on the short term and the immediate needs, rather than people thinking about, well, for the next 20 years, here is where I need to go. Now, there's a problem with that, and the problem with that is that there's a high risk of maladaptation, which is a sort of a technical term, which means that people do adapt, but actually they adapt wrongly, and it's wrong with hindsight. That's kind of the key thing about maladaptation. Is it's not that they did anything wrong in and of itself, and you can't always tell until afterwards whether the way in which they adapted turned out to be right or wrong, but you have to make your best analysis. And I know Kate's going to talk a little bit more about maladaptation, which will save me having to talk about it. So then we looked at, now, how are these development interventions of all these various different kinds, how are they helping people build their adaptive capacity? So, well, let's look at the kind of interventions. And the range of interventions which we looked at was pretty broad. I mean, it was everything from safety net programs, irrigation, agricultural extension, rural development of different kinds, establishing savings and credit groups, capacity building and so on. So a very, very broad range, but actually remarkably similar. And the similarities come if you don't look at it from a technical lens, but if you start looking at it through the lens of those the five perspectives that I talked about. And you see three common threads among almost all of the projects. First is we're delivering technology packages. I mean, a technology can be an agricultural technology, it can be like, you know, a savings technology or an irrigation technology, but it's saying, here's the recipe, here is how to do things differently from what you were doing before, follow my recipe, that's what you do. Here's the seed, here's the spacing, here's the sowing date, you know, here's everything. And we give people that. And we tell people, that's the right way, you follow it and you're fine. We tend to give people the assets, so we will install the irrigation, you know, here it is, you plonk it in. Here are the seeds you should be growing. There they are. So lots and lots of direct provision of assets. And an awful lot of group creation and capacity building. Sometimes this is thought to help knowledge sharing. So it's like, okay, you know, we need a project committee, half men, half women, please. It has to be 10 people. You elect them. You know, anyone who's familiar with development will be nodding and going, oh yeah, we've been there, done that. Okay, so let's have a look now at... We can't quite take the five lenses in turn because, I mean, you can see it saw from the diagram, they're very much overlapping and interlinking. But if we go through, let's have a look and see how we score, how our development interventions score. Well, we start by finding actually a missing link. We wanted to look at the different, you know, the link between the assets which people have and adaptive capacity, and we find that the link just isn't there. What do we mean by that? Well, we gave people a package. Now, if we think about it, if we want people to have adaptive capacity, then what people need to know is how to find assets and how to use them. So if we accept that change is inevitable, then whatever package I give them today is not going to be the right package for 5 years' time or 10 years' time, either because the climate's changed, or because they've been displaced, or because they've had to cut their farm in half to divide between their 8 kids, or because the price of their crop has dropped, whereas the price of something, etc., etc., etc. But we're giving them the package. And what we didn't do, when I say we, I kind of mean we, the development world in general. I'm not very good at kind of teaching people where to find new ideas, where to find technologies. We weren't very good at saying, well, look, here is a way of doing it, but look, you can tinker with it, and here is how to tinker, and here is how to know whether your tinkering is working or not. So that's one problem. And the other problem is what we've called what makes assets come alive. What do we mean by that? An asset doesn't actually deliver anything without an institutional framework. Because, for example, you can put in an irrigation system, but you haven't actually given people water. You've given people an irrigation system. And they won't get the water unless there is... I mean, it's a sort of bit of a technical, sociological word, but we call them institutions. It's the ways in which people work together and set rules and enforce rules to make sure that the system gives people water, which is everything from the maintenance of it to how the thing gets shared out. And what did we find? Well, one thing you often find is what's called elite capture. So, for example, the women in Ethiopia complain. I should stress this was not a complaint about an irrigation system put in by any of the development projects. This was previous work by the government, doesn't matter. And they're going, well, actually, it's great. The irrigation system is really fine. We don't get any water. Well, why not? Well, female-headed households, we're really low status. We're kind of last on the pecking order. But that's fine if you can pay a bribe to the committee and then you get your water. But the fact that we're female-headed households mean we actually don't have very much income, and therefore we can't afford the bribe either. So occasionally we get a trickle of water, but that's all we ever get. So you think you've given people water, you gave them an asset, the infrastructure, but you didn't give them the water because the institutional side is missing. So that's what we're talking about. There are other ways in which institutions and the way in which we work with institutions can undermine the sustainability. And remember, sustainability and adaptive capacity are intimately linked. sometimes we set up a whole new set of institutions. I mean, NGOs, I'm afraid, do like setting up their own committees. And sometimes, if they're not socially grounded, you know, we say, well, it has to be 10 people. But if people work typically in a way which has 20 people, well, we kind of go, no, that's too many. But if it's not by their culture, and you've created an artificial number, then the thing's going to fall apart. If it's not rooted in the way they do things. And we did find that fairly commonly. Instead of building on, people always have their own institutions. They might not call them an institution or even a group or an organisation, but people have ways of working together, and if you don't build on it, then that's a shame. And sometimes we just forgot altogether about the institutional side. So there was one project which technically seemed to be quite good. It was copying what was going on in one area, and it got people brought people to see it. It was in an area, and it was showing them how they could actually fence off some area and leave the pasture to grow for their animals, for livestock, in a fairly dry area of Ethiopia. And they then started doing it in their own villages, but they abandoned it after a year or two because nothing had been set up about, well, who makes a decision about when it can be cut and who's allowed in and so on. And it wouldn't have been that hard to have kind of thought about it, but because it was just completely forgotten about, people didn't bother taking it forward. Institutions, and taking the word very, very broadly now, can actually also undermine innovation, which is another key characteristic, and it's maybe one of the most key, because that is around the driver of change in itself. One of the key institutions, which isn't often called an institution, is people's culture and people's cultural rules. And there are plenty of places where, no, that's not how we do things, is a dominant culture. Like doing things differently from your elders in some places. There are ways in which you may be socially acceptable to innovate, and maybe there are ways in which it's less sociably acceptable. There are societies where people who do things differently are looked up to, and there are societies where people who do things differently are, especially if it doesn't work first time, as it often doesn't, are kind of laughed at. And we did get stories about people going, well, you know, I got called mad, so some people said I got called mad, but I persisted, and now they want to know, and some people said I got called mad and, you know, didn't carry on with it. But when we come in as outsiders, and I mean, I should say, we isn't just like the NGO world. I mean, we're talking also about government services and so on. We're talking about, you know, anything from the outside the village, this was rural, coming in to try and develop things. We really weren't recognising innovations. We were neither building on the ways in which people develop new ideas for themselves, nor were we trying to analyse to say, right, there are sources of new ideas in your village and they're being blocked, or here is what could free up a much greater thing. And, you know, whether it's confidence or information flow, sometimes it's people's ability to risk and so on. Sometimes we're undermining it, actually, because if our message is, don't think for yourself, don't adapt, don't be creative, I am telling you the right way, and I am the big boss, you know, I've got the white coat, if you like, a metaphorical white coat, then actually we're often undermining innovation without realising it. If we treated information as being a part of adaptive capacity, we wouldn't give people one piece of information. We'd say, look, here's a range, choose. We wouldn't say, here, this is the best seed because it will give you the highest kilogram per hectare, which is not what people are trying to maximise usually anyway. They're much more worried about how many dollars per day's labour on the field. So often we've even got the wrong criteria when we're judging what the best thing is. We'd give people far more sources. We'd teach people where to get information from. And then a key phrase, which I think is turning information into knowledge. I think it's a continuum. We're very good at collecting masses of data. We're not very good, but we do some turning data into information, which is kind of making it usable, if you like. But we're very, very poor about the knowledge side, which is actually giving people a capacity to take that information and make it practical. We have to say that development agencies, you know, there's this short-term and reactive stuff. We are as short-term and reactive as everybody else. If you look at the design of the projects, they are not focusing on where is this village going to be in 10 years. They often do the shopping list participation. What do you need? What do you want me to do? And if people are focused on the short-term and are not thinking ahead, then we just merely echo that in the name of participation. Of course, I mean, how do we plan for an uncertain future? We need planning, but we need planning for uncertainty, which is a different kind of planning. The answer is adaptive capacity. What we call people building people's agency. Agency here doesn't mean an agency like an NGO. It means people's ability to design their own plans and to be able to bring them to fruition. Okay, in short, it's a very, very quick summary. In short, what does this mean for development practice and climate change? Well, the first thing is, They are together. We don't want to separate them too much. Climate change is a part of the development challenge. It shouldn't be a separate silo and a separate sector. Yeah? That doesn't mean that there aren't things which are like the mitigation and the greenhouse gas reductions. That's kind of separate. We're talking here about the adaptation side of climate change, I should stress. We believe that the development interventions, as they are going, could bring a huge stimulus into adaptive capacity, and we're missing out on it. We need to change the way we do development. First of all, the heart of the development intervention shouldn't be, I want you to be in this state when I leave, tick the box, but it should be around, I want you all to have this much more ability to devise for yourself what you wanted from your lives and to be able to achieve it. Yeah? We need to be agency builders as agency. Yeah? The idea of governance is not about governments only, it's around making rules, making decisions, and that needs to improve all stakeholders. That includes donors, it includes NGOs, and of course government at all levels. And the changes which are needed are very, very far-reaching, and I mean maybe we'll talk about it in the questions afterwards. But if you want to deliver a very, very different kind of development that's agency-focused, then what do you promise your donor, for example? What does the donor need in terms of a log frame, in terms of deliverables and outputs? It's like, oh well, I'm going to talk to people about. It's very, very hard. So the way in which we administer aid, the way in which we design it, manage it, very, very different. And the skill sets, the technical side is very different. We employ agricultural graduates to be our extension agents or irrigation specialists and so on. And these aren't people who understand how to analyse power in a society and institutions and cultural norms and so on. They're not necessarily good at encouraging people to think for themselves. They're better educated than the villagers, and therefore they think that they can tell the villagers what to do. And this applies to whether they are from the country, from the region, international. It really is all the same. Those are the big five, as they're called. Planning much longer term, not planning for next year. Thinking about where are people going to be in 5 or 10 years. Thinking about innovation. So not trying to think about the innovations I will bring you, meaning specific changes, but encouraging a ferment of new ideas and working out how that can be done. Thinking about the institutions, and particularly the word coming out of that is the fourth one, which is power. If things are the way they are and the rich are rich, there's usually a power reason behind it. And trying to think not in terms of providing people with information, but in terms of people giving people knowledge. And that means always thinking about the tools that people need to reflect, analyse and make their own decisions using the information. Okay, the last slide. Big problem here. Absolutely none of what I have said couldn't have been said 20 years ago or even 30 years ago. In fact, no, nothing that I've said wasn't said 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Nothing to do with climate change, nothing to do with adaptive capacity. It's all to do with good common sense development. Oh dear. Well, yes, oh dear, but the fact that something has been said, if we didn't listen last time, sadly, we've just got to keep on repeating it until the message gets through. Climate change has actually given it a new urgency and a new importance, because we cannot prepare for climate change without doing well what we should have been doing well 20 or 30 years ago. Innovation got studied 20 years ago, it dropped off the agenda, no one talks about it anymore, and we want to try and bring back. But one more thing about the last 20 or 30 years that I think we need to do, my last comment. It's no good just repeating, we should have done it differently, here is how. We have to say, well, hold on a minute, people told us that 20 years ago. What were the things which stopped us from taking those lessons on board? Because until we turn our attention to that, we're actually going to be in a groundhog age, and we're going to be going round and round and round. And in 30 years' time, I will probably be too old for it, but my successors will be giving exactly the same presentation. I hope not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Brilliant. Clearly lots of food for thought.